Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus, and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going to be taking a look at the much requested ABBA back in 1979 performing Gimme, Gimme, Gimme. So let's get these four up on screen and see how they get on. I'm just going to jump in here while we get into a bit of choreography, because ABBA were one of those bands that had the mastery of the hardest department that I always refer to it as in the music industry and as an artist, a musician, writing great songs. And they just wrote song after song after song. There was just hit after hit after hit, because of the appreciation that they all had individually as musicians, but also, obviously, Benny and Bjorn as songwriters together, having such an affinity for melody and putting everything together musically. Also, we've got these two great singers at the front of the stage who are not only singers, but have such a great ear for melody themselves. So it means that when they'd gather around the piano, they would often come up with lines as a four-piece vocally that would then work together. Some of those lines would be hooks that could be instrumental hooks played on the piano or the guitar. Others would be vocal hooks and vocal phrases that they throw in there. And you've got underlying progressions that Benny and Bjorn would throw in there. So there is so much to it, but they just had it down to an art. Just taking this chorus as an example, because there's so much going on. With the first 2 or 3 bars, we've got just the lead vocal in there being harmonized with, and then the backing harmonies come in and supply that alternative underlayer to the lead vocal. And then by the end of the chorus, just before the turnaround, we get a little riff, a little hook right at the end, and that was in the last bar, and then the whole process starts again. So this chorus is just the same section repeated, but there's so much changing all the time that once you've heard it once through, you're ready to hear it again, and you want to hear these hooks and the little line that's right at the end of every phrase of that chorus. At the end of the 8th bar of every chorus, you'll get that cool little hook, and then it will just reset and repeat. You can have this view about every ABBA composition because there is always so much going on, but it always stems from a simplistic, memorable melody. And it's something that when you hear a song just once, you can remember the chorus and you'll be singing it back in your head. And when you rewind back to the beginning, the beauty about these kind of compositions with ABBA is that there's so much depth and complexity to the arrangement and to the composition that is just hiding underneath the simplicity of the melody. And this is when you rewind it back to the beginning and you hear it for a second time, you start to notice the hooks. Then you listen again and you start to notice all the harmonies in there. You listen again, you can hear the piano, you can hear the guitar, you can hear the riffs going on. So there is so much depth to it. And this is the art form of writing a hit that sounds on the surface so simplistic and so easy, but then break it down musically, and we've got some seriously complex things going on with the timing of all of the riffs, with the harmony lines. Of course, you've got to have technically advanced singers and technically able singers in order to sing harmony lines like I mentioned before. Fortunately, they've got these two ladies at the front of the stage who are such great singers technically and singing in harmony with each other, also being able to control their voices, vibrato, you name it, they've got a handle on it. Just putting the spotlight on Agnieszka when I'm talking about that vocal control that she has at 2 minutes and 4 seconds, the way that she holds on to that note and just applies vibrato at the end of the line, but it is so controlled and it's a slow, wide vibrato that just gets that note to sing. And by adding it to the end of the vocal phrase and the vocal line, it means that the line is interesting the whole way through because she's bang on pitch to start with, and then after holding that note straight, just applying that vibrato, just sells it. And it is such a great sound, just Agnieszka's voice, full stop, when she's got such control. You could listen to that kind of thing all day. Not to take anything away from Frida, because in this live version of the song, they're both singing the main vocal, that main melody line in the chorus, but they can mix their voices so well, it just sounds like one uniform voice. So Agnieszka and Frida have got such control that they can not only match each other pitch-wise, sing in harmony with each other as well if required, but nail it dead on pitch and adjust their tone so that those two voices blend into one and are separate from the backing harmonies that we've got going on, because we have got backing singers here as well. Of course, on YouTube there are a lot of ABBA videos that are overdubbed with the recorded version on it, and obviously a lot of music videos as well, but we're definitely looking at a fully live video here, which you can tell because of the push tempo we've got going on. And this is something that I do mention in other videos about the drums just being pushed and being a little bit faster than the original recorded version, and it certainly is here, to the point where we've got a very dramatic decrease in tempo into the verses. And this is obviously rehearsed and something that they've worked on because they're all slowing down at the same rate. But I think maybe when the tempo starts to speed up, it's just on that borderline of being a little bit too fast, but they all handle it so well. This is the thing about ABBA playing live. When we analyze it, we've effectively got two lead singers at the front of the stage, a pianist and a guitarist. So getting the same sound as the records and how produced they were would be impossible for the four of them to achieve. And I know that they could strip things back and do a performance that way. They've all got the ability to sing and harmonize with each other, but replicating those released records would certainly be a full band setup that would be required. And that's exactly what we've got here. We've got so many musicians that put in all of those production elements that you got on the records. So a great live performance all around here. And ABBA were perfectionists in the studio to get that sound exactly right. They'd often spend 5 days mixing one track. And this is often something that happens. It's good to go back to a track the next day to have fresh ears so that you can hear the mix without being oversaturated with the sound, because that can happen with mixing. Anyone who's into production will know what I'm talking about. At the end of the video, we'll get a little bit into the history, but let's get back into this performance. And there we have it. I think ABBA, as a band, were the perfect mix, because sometimes you have songwriters who never really make it into the spotlight because they write for other artists, and then those artists become very successful. But ABBA had great songwriters in there as a four-piece because they would all get together and exchange ideas. But I'm sure these songwriters are always looking for great vocalists in order to put their ideas in front of people, but really sell the ideas as they were thinking of them. You always imagine a great vocalist in your head when you're writing a song. And that's exactly what Bjorn and Benny had. These two women at the front of the stage that had such great vocal ability. Like I said, just the perfect mix of vocal ability, songwriting ability, and technical ability at instruments, because they had to be able to play an instrument, and I'm talking about the composers here for the most part, Bjorn and Benny, in order to get the ideas down and to arrange them exactly how they were hearing it, all in their head. And back in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, you had to be able to play an instrument to write music and compose. Those that didn't play an instrument would have to go to somebody who did and try and sing the notes and find out what chords they're imagining in their head. More often than not, the person who played the instrument would come up with the chord variations and the root chords for whatever the singer's singing, and whatever the chords played underneath will then give a slightly different sound to the melody that the singer might be singing, and the singer might think, oh yeah, that's an interesting take on what I was imagining in my head, so I'll use that chord. So it's something that nowadays you can get computers that give you all the chords. So just to get into a bit of the background behind ABBA, I'm sure you guys already know a lot of this information, but starting with Benny and Bjorn, because they were in separate bands. Benny was aged 18 when he was in the band called Hepstars, and they were referred to as the Swedish Beatles. So they were very popular, and Bjorn was also in a band at the same time, and they were called the Hootenanny Singers. So because they were playing in the same circles and they were playing at the same venues, they bumped into each other and decided to start writing songs together. So it just so happened that there's this thing called Eurovision, which I'm not sure people outside Europe really get, but it's like a competition for songs, and all the nations in Europe compete to have the best song. But anyway, Benny had written a song for the Swedish entry for Eurovision, but unfortunately it wasn't taken on. But being involved with that process is when he first bumped into Frida, but it was only a brief meeting. They didn't get together properly at that point. So Bjorn and Benny's bands went their separate ways and broke up, so then Bjorn and Benny got together and started to record some of these songs and ideas that they had been working on together. Just shifting the focus to Agneta, because by the age of 18, she had already had a #1 in the Swedish charts, and she was writing and performing her own material, which in itself was a rare thing for a female artist to be doing, not only in Sweden, but across the whole music industry. She had multiple charting singles, and during a TV special that was being filmed, she bumped into Bjorn for the first time, and they got on famously well, and in 1969, when this was, they started their relationship at that time. That was the same year that Frida bumped into Benny at, first of all, a festival called Melody Festival, but they bumped into each other again a few weeks later at another concert, and that's where they started their relationship together. In 1970, they decided to go on holiday as a four, and this turned into their first live performance. I think it started out as them singing on the beach and then somehow turned into them performing for UN soldiers who were based in Cyprus, which is where they went at that time. And apparently it didn't go down particularly well, so they thought maybe it wasn't a good idea for all four of them to sing together, but they still recorded together in the studio, and of course Bjorn and Benny kept on writing. But then Benny and Bjorn had a bit of a breakthrough, because one of their Swedish spoken songs that they had written got to #1 in the Swedish charts. So they kept on writing, and in 1972 they wrote She's My Kind of Girl, and that was a top 10 hit in Japan. So they started to think maybe we're onto something here. So in 1972 they wrote People Need Love, and this was the first song that they recorded all together, and that did really well. It got to #17 in the Swedish charts. So they started to think that maybe we're not as bad as we thought initially at performing together. The other thing about that song is that it charted in the USA, but unfortunately the label that distributed it at the time was Playboy Records, which wasn't a big label, so the amount of copies that they wanted to distribute, they couldn't. So they just couldn't get the volume of sales that they wanted, because they literally couldn't distribute the amount that people wanted to buy. 1973 is when they decided on the band name ABBA, and as you probably all know, it's just each letter of their first names put together. What you might not know is that ABBA in the 70s was a very popular fish canning company in Sweden, but it wasn't known around the world. So because they owned that trademark ABBA, the band, had to go to the fish canning company and try and get the rights from them to use that as a band name. And this is how things used to happen back in the day. They just went to the fish canning company and asked them, can we use ABBA as our band name? And they said, okay, as long as you don't bring any embarrassment to our product, then it's fine. And that was it. There wasn't any contracts or anything. They just said, okay, go for it. So they were then known as ABBA from 1973 onwards. Just a bit of trivia about the logo as well, because I'm sure you all know it, where the first B is back to front. So it looks like it's a mirror image halfway down the logo. And this is Wolfgang Heineman's, who was taking pictures of them whilst they were holding letters of the band, and it was supposed to spell out ABBA, but Benny had his round the wrong way and he was holding the B. So when Wolfgang then developed these photos, he could see ABBA with that B round the wrong way. So he then came up with this as a proposal for the band logo. In 1974 is when their big breakthrough came. They performed Waterloo at the Eurovision Song Contest, and they won the contest for that year. And they performed the song in English, which meant that it went to #1 in the UK. It was a massive hit all across Europe, and it got to #6 in the USA. So due to this success, they then went on tour around Europe. And unfortunately, during the first half of this tour, they actually had to cancel shows because they hadn't sold enough tickets. So they were a bit downhearted. They continued the tour. And the second half of the tour was the exact opposite, because that took them back through Scandinavia, where they had massive support for every show. And I think Bjorn said at a later date that they were trying to be too glam, because that just was what the music industry was going through at that time. So during 1975 and 1976, they were releasing such hits as SOS and Mamma Mia. Also, Fernando was released with the Greatest Hits album in 1976, and that song in itself was a massive hit as well as the Greatest Hits album. Just a bit of trivia about Chiquitita, that was donated to UNICEF in terms of the copyrights for that song. So anytime that is played or downloaded, the money goes to UNICEF. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to go through every ABBA hit because there's too many of them. But fast forwarding to 1979, this is when Agnieszka and Bjorn unfortunately divorced. They said that it wouldn't affect anything though, and it didn't. They kept releasing hit after hit, having massive success. In 1981 was when Bjorn remarried, and it was also the same year that Benny and Frida mentioned that they were filing for divorce as well. And by 1982, 1983, they were going in different directions. Obviously, from a personal perspective, it is so difficult to have 4 people in a band who used to be married and now are separated, and keeping the personal and professional side of the relationship totally separate is definitely going to be something that would have been awkward. So around this time, they were going their own separate ways, and by 1986, I think that was the year that was their last real performance together, and they hadn't actually been together for about 2 years, maybe over 2 years before 1986, so they really had gone their own separate ways by that time. Just to finish with, ABBA totally dominated the UK charts when they were releasing albums, because they had 8 consecutive #1 albums in our charts. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015. There's a movie in 2008 called Mamma Mia that featured all of their songs, and that soundtrack went to #1 in the US charts. They've sold over 385 million records. I think that's actually quite a conservative estimate. It's probably a lot more than that. But Bjorn has also mentioned that in 2020 there will be 5 new ABBA songs, and that's all part of a digital entertainment experience that he's involved with at the moment. So that'll be interesting to see what happens with those compositions and that experience as a whole. But it's great to look back and be able to experience this performance firsthand from 1979 with all of the band involved in order to get that sound that you got from the record, but in a live setting. So thank you guys for all of the requests to take a look at ABBA, and keep all of your suggestions coming in the comments section below. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!